watch Caribbean Predator.
Once again, we would like to welcome you to a special edition of Caribbean Body Talk, where the vision gets clearer every time. My name is Gloria Vernon, your BBC Special Assignment reporter, coming to you from Sugar Jam Studio. Today we have the pleasure of conversing with Mr. Herman Hall. Mr. Herman Hall is the publisher of Everybody's Magazine. Welcome, Mr. Hall.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Hall, how did you get started in journalism?
Well, essentially, that was about 20 odd years ago. First of all, I was in the West Indian Carnival Association. I was an executive member, public relation director, and so forth of the carnival. And one of my responsibilities then was to handle the annual Carnival Journal. But prior to that, when I was going to Brooklyn College, actually, when I completed my undergraduate work, I was going to go to Columbia University to do journalism. But a professor told me, Herman, you should do law instead. There is nothing in journalism. So I followed his idea and decided to go to law school, except I never went to law school. Right? You know, that's the thing. But then, during that time, I was a member of the West Indian Carnival Association, the people who put out the carnival here in Brooklyn on Labor Day.
Yes.
So then, since some for what reason or the other, journalism was in my blood. So then by being responsible for putting out the annual journal, I decided that I will go into it full-time on my own, because I thought that the Caribbean American community needed its own magazine.
Great. So what would you say, what could you tell our listening audience about the pros and cons of publishing and editing?
Oh, well, there's a lot of cons and there's a lot of pros.
More cons and pros.
I would tell you something. When some people usually say, when some people look back at their life, men or women, let us say you hit your late 40s or 50s, and say, but I can't believe I used to do those crazy things that I did when I was in my 20s.
Yes.
And the same thing. 20 years ago, had I known what journalism or publishing was all about, maybe I would not have gone into it. Because in a true sense, a journalist is not really a publisher. A publisher ought to be a business person. So most successful journalists never crossed that line to become an owner of something or to coordinate it from a business perspective. But I will say the con and the negative is this, that if you do not have enough investment, it makes no sense attempting to get into it. And actually, I started it with $100. And 20 years later, I'm still trying to find another second $100. So that is one, having enough investment is one. And two, understanding the publishing business, because there's a big difference between journalism and publishing. The publisher, editing or the editorial component is just one component of the overall picture. The publisher has to make sure his or her publication is on the newsstand, or it is circulated, or there is a certain amount of advertisement into it, or in other words, there is a marketing plan. So you can put out the best publication in the world from an editorial perspective with some of the world's finest writers, but if it is not get into the marketplace and no one sees it, then it becomes useless. But in order to get it into the marketplace, you must have a knack of what it is all about. Here in the Caribbean American community, one believes that, that your publication should be, let us say, in the corner store, and that's it. But the corner store could only give you just amount of readers, of subscribers. You need to get it beyond the corner store and get into different parts of the country. And basically, from a Caribbean American perspective in terms of publishing and writing and so forth, Everybody's Magazine, I would assume, perhaps is the only one of the various Caribbean publications that reach a broad-based audience. So, for example, we have subscribers from Alaska all the way down to Houston, to New Orleans, back to Miami, back to Rhode Island, and so forth. So I think this is one. In terms of the positiveness of it, apart, you feel that you are doing a community service, a public service. Of course, I would say for the most part of the 20 years in this magazine, it has been, I think, a labor of love, or work of labor, or labor of love, the saying. In other words, we really do it for doing it as a public service, hoping you are providing an essential service. But at times, you put that before making a profit. So while the district would like to make a profit, you would like to employ people, but yet you do a lot of things that is in the interest of the community. So for example, I could run perhaps my grandmother naked on the cover, and most likely I may get a lot of sales. On the other hand, I may feel that running someone in the block who has done something very good, from a moral perspective, the person should be on the cover, even if that may not generate sales. So in a sense, you have the ability to control what you put in and what you don't put in.
That's interesting. I was just getting back to the transition that you said between a publisher and a journalist, and you were saying that it's very seldom that does that happen, right. That a journalist would transform over into a publisher because of the business aspect of publishing, or?
Yes, it is like, publishing is like an artist, maybe a painter. A painter may love the art of painting, but in terms of marketing his or her own painting, he or she leaves that to someone else. Or it may be a good baseball player or a sports person, or an artist or musician. They may leave the booking, the performances in terms of the monetary part of it to an agent to handle. And I think that the same thing, in a sense, applies in the area of publishing. Basically, publishers focus, as I said, on the marketing. They coordinate the whole picture. But most important, they are the ones who are responsible for generating enough income to pay the writers. On the other hand, a journalist, most journalists are not really interested in that part. They are more concerned in healing the world. I mean, I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, I went to a big institution, the New York Times, and there was a friend of mine, I came to know, and he was working at the New York Times, I think, for 25 years as a reporter at the New York Times, and he only went into the design room where the artwork is done only at 2 and 3 occasions. But this is in a very big institution, and in the world of publishing and artwork, we don't measure by inches or yards. We measure by what you call picas. And once they use 1 or 2 of those terminology, he had no idea of what I was talking about. But he was strictly a reporter. Now you have a number of people who usually go into publishing. On the other hand, I think Mr. Johnson, the owner of Ebony, is a classic. Although in his book he says it's very, very difficult to be publisher and editor. So I think for the most of his time, once he got his publication going 50 years ago, he has more concentrated on the business end. I think in my case, in terms of Everybody's Magazine, in most of the 20 years, I'm more focused on the editorial. But in recent years, I've been attempting to focus more on the publishing. But when you're both the publisher and the editor, one gives way to the other. So when the magazine is looking very good editorially, when we get the most praise for the quality of the articles and the pictures, then you will find that there are very few advertisements. And consequently, when there is a lot of nice advertisements in the magazine, you will find that the editorial quality went down. It is simply because we have been concentrating on the other.
Yes, definitely. You mentioned something about your mother running across the front of the page, and that would bring in a lot of sales. But as a child, did you ever dream that you would reach as many people and touch as many lives as you have today? And you're talking about all across the country. People are buying the magazine from Alaska to Florida to Rhode Island, etc. But did you ever dream that would happen as a child? Was this one of your thoughts, or?
Not really, but in a sense, sometimes when I check back on my background, for example, I grew up in Grenada in the 50s in the country, and it is not like the 80s and the 90s. I mean, Grenada was still a colony and so forth. And in my village, very few people were able to read and write. As a matter of fact, my aunt who raised me, basically adopted me, she never knew how to read and write. Whereas her husband, right, he knew how to read and write. And occasionally he used to give lessons to some of the villagers. And I remember sometime when we get the paper from England, in those days when you get a paper from England or from America, that paper may be 2 or 3 years old, I would assume.
Okay.
But yet you will go under the nutmeg tree and read it, especially if there was a picture of the Queen, let us say, the Queen of England on it. But so then there was that sense of community spirit in him, whereas he used to try to help people in the community. And I'm afraid to say that has more or less rubbed off on me. And I find myself here in New York, basically in most cases doing a lot of things, in that sense of community.
You talk about the Grenada as opposed to America. Are you satisfied with the state of affairs of the Caribbean American people?
Well, basically, I will say frankly with you, no. And if anyone was to read my writings in recent times, for example, my article on Shopton on the upcoming mayoral election,
yes,
in the April issue of the magazine, or my long article on Reverend Andres, the priest,
yes,
from one of the Caribbean islands that got into some problems in the winter. I use those certain things to show what I call the weaknesses. Basically, it's a large, and it's a vibrant community. There's no question about it. The Caribbean Americans are some of the largest consumer groups maybe in New York City, and perhaps in terms of the vote, the Caribbean American vote can become very, very, very important in any election. But we operate as individual islands and groups within those islands, and we don't operate as a national body. So for example, you may take Island A. So Island A may have its function as separate from Island B. But even when you examine Island A, you may find that there may be 20 little groups within Island A that also organize independently of each other. So when there is an emergency, there is not really a national group that could coordinate and come to the rescue immediately. So for example, suppose a little child was stricken with cancer in one of the islands, and they needed $90,000 to bring this child up here. And those things do happen. Or there is a major earthquake or hurricane in the Caribbean. There is really no mobilization effort in a coordinated way, because by the time each little group goes its way to go through its own rules of order, its own protocol, so by the time they make a decision as to what they could do, it's 2-3 months down the line. Let us take, for example, as recent as this week, the young Trinidadian boy who was killed by the police this week, meaning in April, by the cops in Washington Heights. We are all talking about it, but there's not a collective voice, there's not a collective leadership could say, we take a position. The same thing with the immigration, or with the shipwright, or any of the events or issues that are in the Caribbean. We here as a people, we speak against it, but yet as a collective body, there is no voice. I would have to say the only time we come together as a people, unfortunately, is for cultural activities such as the big carnival on Labor Day.
What would you do to change that? You're a publisher, you're a journalist as well. You've been doing this for 20 years, and you're out there in the community. You're making changes. I did read the article on Al Sharpton, and you said that this is a person that is for the community, for the Caribbean American people, as well as cultural facets. So what would you do to change this? I'm sure your opinion is worth a lot.
Yeah, well, basically, I think much more emphasis should be given to the younger people.
Yes.
Unfortunately, and the day I think I fall into that category, I will regret it. Unfortunately, here in the Caribbean American community, and not only in the Caribbean American community in New York, but if you go to Boston or you go to Baltimore, or you go to any of those communities, you will find the same thing. That the people who heads organization, they do not know when it is time to quit or step down. And you may get Island A having 15 organizations. But when you check each of these individual organizations at any one meeting, the collective membership maybe only consists of 12 people. And the day the president is voted out, he no longer takes an active role. You get what I'm saying? And most important, you have people here who have contributed in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, 70s, the 80s, and so forth. And these are old men, but they would not give the opportunity for the younger people to create a voice. So, for example, if, let us say, a television station on Labor Day wanted someone to speak a little on the Caribbean American community, it is some of these old people, I'm not criticizing them in that sense, but they just do not know when to stop. And I think this is across the board. It's a new Caribbean, it's a vibrant people. Now, like for example, 20, 30 years ago, the person who was born here of Caribbean parentage, or who came here at a very young age as Caribbean parentage, was afraid of his heritage. And when you look at the people like the Belafontes of this world, it is only now they are claiming that sort of heritage. But times have changed. But the young people of today, once in high school, they are not afraid to say where they are from, where their parents came from. So I think if this could be done, then we'll see a remarkable progress in that area.
Oh, thank you for your opinion. It was very great. You're watching Caribbean Body Talk, a BBC presentation. My name is Gloria Vernon, and we'll be right back.
Don't switch that channel. Discover the Caribbean and your community on Caribbean Body Talk, where the vision gets clearer every time.
Welcome back to Caribbean Body Talk. Our guest is Mr. Hall. He's the publisher of Everybody's Magazine. Mr. Hall, what do you perceive as being the difference in publishing in the United States as opposed to Grenada?
Well, in a sense, I left Grenada at a very early age. I only work in one place in Grenada. That is when I graduated from school in Grenada in '64. I taught briefly for 2 years. So all my work experience has been in the United States. So it's fair to say I only spent the first 21 to 22 years of my life in Grenada. However, I travel the Caribbean very frequent. So in my visits to the Caribbean, I could always observe. And actually in the last 20 years, I've covered every single major event in the Caribbean firsthand as a reporter, from the death of Eric Williams to the invasion of Grenada by the United States, by the coup d'etat in Grenada in 1979, the funeral of Tom Adams, and actually I was perhaps the only Caribbean reporter, which was indeed the only one, to have traveled with the White House press when President Reagan visited Jamaica and Barbados in 1982. So by doing that, I could observe. And what I would say will be the major difference, especially in the small islands, has to do with politics. That any publication or radio station of that nature has to do what the government would like to do. So the minute time you say something that the government don't like, obviously they would put some pressure on you. I think in the case of Jamaica, it's quite different. Journalists, I would say, to a certain extent, pretty much independent, and they can do what, as long as they exercise a certain amount of responsibility. But even here, right here in the United States, there are a couple of Caribbean ambassadors. If they don't like what we say about them in the publication, they will call us, and I will say, well, hey, you're not in your island, So I think that will be the difference, maybe the size of the island.
Is there freedom?
Yeah, there's freedom, yeah. But I will say that the government will be more looking at what you do. Because every government in the island that gets into the power, they want the media to be the public relation company. Unfortunately, this should not be the case in journalism.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Is there a history of Caribbean journalism? Is there some sort of history that you can...
Well, basically, in a technical sense, in a very technical sense, you can say that the overall black journalism in this country is part of the Caribbean journalism, in the sense that the father of black journalism in this country, John B. Rostrom, it was he who founded Freedom's Journal. This was the first publication by black people in this country, period, and that was in the 19th century. When he founded Freedom Journal in 1827, John B. Rostrom, but he came from, I think it was Montego Bay. But in those days, this is the 19th century America, they didn't care where the heck you came from. You were just another black person in the States. So there was no such thing as a West Indian, but in a technical sense, he came from the islands. So you can say the father of black journalism in this country that we all adore happens to be John B. Rostrom, who came from the Caribbean or from Africa via the Caribbean, via Jamaica. In my research and history, there have been attempts since the 1930s to have a Caribbean American presence, especially in the New York area. In the 30s, there was a journal created. And in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you will see from time to time somebody attempted to start a newspaper or a magazine. Right now, there are many publications dealing with Caribbean Americans, published by Caribbean American people. As a matter of fact, there are 2 publications right now in New York City that's supposed to be servicing Caribbean Americans, and they are not owned by Caribbean Americans. Okay. I think the first one is the new monthly magazine in the Daily News, which is supposed to be helping Caribbean American people, which is very good. There is nothing negative about that. But the point is there is a market for that. And then there's another publication, a free weekly paper that is not owned by Caribbean nor African Americans. But overall, I will say though that Everybody's Caribbean Magazine is the first publication, Caribbean American publication, to have gone for 20 consecutive years without failure. And in the last 20 years, I would have to say I am the one, or our publication is the one that most people, other publishers have followed. So I will have to say in the modern day, in the last 20 or 30 years, it was Everybody's Caribbean Magazine that perhaps created a path for others to follow. And these days you have scores of Caribbean American publications, especially in the New York area.
So, and speaking of the 20 years that you've been around and all that you've done with with Everybody's Magazine, what did you do 20 years ago that you're not doing now?
Well, 20 years ago, I think I spent a lot of my time in making sure the magazine was distributed. But that had its disadvantage, because then you could never get the magazine out on time. So 20 years ago, we had much of a visibility in the community. So you saw us in every little bakery and in every little record store. But 20 years ago, people read. 20 years ago now, you don't get too much people who go to the bakeries and in the record stores buying, especially a quality publication. So what we do now different is that we are basically a subscription based. So we reach a lot of lawyers, we reach a lot of doctors, the professional type. And I don't think there is a day or a month go by when someone do not need the publication for a reference. A case in point is that what most people do not know is that in 1988 we did an exclusive interview with General Colin Powell when he was at the White House.
I guess in conclusion, I would like to just ask you, if you had it to do all over again, if you had to change anything, you said one of your professors said you should be a lawyer. What would you do? Would you become a lawyer?
Now, if I had to do it all over again, most likely I would like to do what I'm doing, because my aim when I was in the Caribbean, my ambition was to stay in Grenada and participate in nation building and in the Caribbean. Since I could not have done it in the Caribbean because I left the Caribbean, I think I'm doing it up here in my own little way. So perhaps the only thing I will do differently, perhaps in starting a publication, I would have tried to raise the capital before going to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Hall.
Thank you.
At this time, I would like to thank our viewers for watching Caribbean Body Talk, where the vision gets clearer every time. My name is Gloria Vernon, and I would like to leave you with this message. Share love, respect, and knowledge. It will make a difference. See you next time on Caribbean Body Talk. Ciao.
When I'm not working, when I'm not playing, when I'm not shopping, I watch